This podcast is sponsored by and recorded at Crossings Pub and Eatery on Hyde Park.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be finding us in the digital universe. Welcome to another edition of the Vicars Crossing. My name is Rob Henderson. I'm the rector and priest at Holy Trinity St. Stephen's Memorial Anglican Church in South London.
And I am Kevin George. I'm the rector of St. Aidan's Church in Northwest London. We like to keep the west side of the city looked after. And we're happy to be here today at the beautiful Crossings Pub and Eatery, where we record these sessions, enjoying Sons of Kent today. What's this one called again?
Sons of Kent. I didn't get the name, actually.
8-track. 8-track.
Is it? That's
it's
what
called
it is?
8-track. Who doesn't remember those good old 8-tracks?
That's right.
Yeah.
And friends from Chatham, my old stomping grounds.
That's right. So
Yep.
we're bringing everything into focus here with some Sons of Kent.
Right. Good. Well, it's good to have everybody back with us, and we enjoyed our first show a little while ago. We want to say thanks to all that took the time to listen. It was a good start for us, and today we're moving on with a special guest that Kevin's going to introduce here in just a minute and get into some interesting talk about that. But before we start, Kevin, what's been going on with you over at St. Aidan's?
Well, we've been still harvesting honey. We got we've taken off. In the last 2 weeks, I think we've sold 200 or 250 jars of honey from the bees that have been at work in Northwest London. I'm happy to say to people when they pick it up that if you live within a 5-kilometer radius of the church, the honey that you're getting has probably been produced from your backyard because the bees have flown that far to pick up their pollen and do the work. So we've been very busy with that, of course, and one of the things people are very excited about at the church is this project, actually. And we've been in heavy preparations for a weekend we've got coming up with a guest speaker. You'll hear more about that in a bit, but with open eyes and clear hearts. We have about 70 people registered to come to that event, and I think you're coming as well, Rob. So
yeah, be there.
It should be a good weekend. And And what about you? What's happening out at St. Stephen's?
Lots going on.
Holy Trinity St. Stephen's
Holy Trinity
Memorial.
St. Stephen's Memorial.
Yes, a big mouthful.
That's right. Yeah, lots going on. It's a busy place, and we're just coming off what was a wonderful night last Saturday. We had a concert in support of the many outreach programs that we support at the church. And I want to say hi and thank you to Dave McEwen, who is our music director at the church, but also a member of the Valley View Male Chorus.
Great bunch of guys.
Of which Kevin has been a part of.
Yep.
But taking a little break right now. And they came out and sang for us. And also had a wonderful opportunity to invite some young people from a group called El Sistema. And they played a little bit before the concert as well. And that was fantastic too. And these kids are wonderful. They come from a variety of different backgrounds, and some are refugees. Some come from disadvantaged homes.
Yep.
And what they've done is come together to learn music. And they came in with their violins and their
the work that El Sistema does is incredible. I mean, you're speaking of crossings, and again, the theme that we're aiming for here is that intersection between faith and the public square. And people like Dave, who are engaged in he does a lot with El Sistema, and these folks are, they're providing music lessons and music opportunities for kids who otherwise wouldn't have.
Yeah, they never would have had the shot. And they're finding gifts in themselves that they never would have discovered, and setting them up for a wonderful journey in their life, and it'll take them to places that they probably hadn't dreamed of. So it's a wonderful, wonderful group, and we were blessed to have them. We had a wonderful night of music and celebration, and to top it off, we're able to support many of our outreach programs that we're involved in, food banks and such. In South,
it was quite
South
a list.
London.
I saw. I was there myself, and the list of programs that are supported by that work is really something.
Yeah, so
you folks are being commended. What is producer Ian up to? What's been going on in your life since we were last together?
Well, our school
keep it clean, Ian.
Try my best. The school I just go, I just went. What am I saying? The school I go to just had their Pops concert. So I've been busy the past couple of days performing music at my high school, in jazz band, choir, the senior band, and a whole bunch of other fun stuff. So that's what I've been up to.
What are you playing?
I play the alto sax in the senior band and wind ensemble. I sing tenor in choir, and I play the tenor sax in jazz band.
That's producer Ian, folks. He's a hit with the ladies. He's always the sax guy. Yeah.
Yeah.
The sax guy is an important guy.
Yeah.
So good for you. So everybody's been busy. What about our sports team? How are your Leafs doing?
Well, I've been kind of busy at concerts, so I haven't been checking up.
Seen what's going on.
I know more about the Leafs, and I don't even like them.
Yeah, I don't like them either.
What's
I think
going
we're,
on?
you know,
I think they've they started off real well. They lost a couple, and then they got back on a winning track this week.
oh
so
yeah. How about
there you
those
go.
Leafs? How about my Montreal Canadiens? Not supposed to be winning any games. Right up near the top of the East.
Yeah. No, they're doing well.
You
How are
guys
your
keep-
Red Wings
The
doing?
Red Wings we're not going to talk about, but I am enjoying the World Series.
Oh,
Yeah, I was just about
Yeah.
to bring that up. I was
Yeah,
just
the
about to
World
ask about
Series is
MLB.
pretty exciting, and I'm a big Tiger fan.
Yes.
Detroit Tiger fan. It's nice to see some of
Yes.
the
Some of our
players that
Tigers.
I've enjoyed over the years actually doing something.
Porcello and the boys.
Porcello and David Price, who pitched for Detroit
Like it.
for a little while, and Ian Kinsler.
Nice.
Yeah, so that's
If your
kind of been
faith
fun
is
to
going to
watch.
cross with the public square, you need to be able to know a little bit about sports.
You
And
do.
and
You
speaking
do.
of faith in sports, you can't be a Detroit Lions fan without having a lot of faith.
No, you need it, and a lot of hope.
A lot of hope. And you know, Rob and I are both Lions fans, and we've been able to get together on Sunday afternoons of late in an establishment not too unlike this one here at Crossings, where we can enjoy an appropriate adult beverage and see faith come to life.
That's right.
In the Lions winning a football game.
See,
which
hope,
we'll not
hope
expect.
abounds. Hope abounds.
abounds.
Yeah.
Well, let me say a word or two about the guests we have this week. We've been very fortunate last night to be at an event at Brescia University College about the life and witness of Henri Nouwen. The guest speaker is our guest here today and will be guest at St. Aidan's Church over the weekend, Michael Higgins. And Michael W. Higgins, not to be confused with the Irish president.
Michael D. Higgins.
Michael D. Higgins. We don't want to get him tangled up with you. But Michael, you may know from his many articles. He's a contributor to the Globe and Mail, Commonweal magazine. He's contributed to the Tablet in Ireland. You may have seen him on CTV commenting on papal affairs in the Vatican. He is a wonderful scholar who has written numerous books about many things, Henri Nouwen, but also Thomas Merton and Jean Vanier and the crises in the church and many other things. And so we're just thrilled to have Michael in town this weekend to share himself with a number of people. And we're glad that he's able to be here with us today. So welcome, Michael.
Welcome.
Pleasure
Welcome.
to be here.
Good to have you.
So you're excited to be in London. Tell us a little bit about it.
Well, excited might be a little over.
Well, I mean, yeah. We need to get him some Sons of Kent.
Obligated.
Somebody bring this man a Sons of Kent.
That's right. Where's that copy? It's good to be back in London. When I was president of St. Jerome's University, I would often come to King's and Brescia and Huron, have occasion to meet with various other faculty at the University of Western Ontario, or Western as it's now called. And so London is not unknown to me. It's a lovely city.
Yeah.
Good to be here. But this is the first time I've been here in a capacity that I have now as a guest for an Anglican weekend.
I know.
That's open for everyone.
It's open to everybody,
Open to
actually.
everyone.
Yeah, we're gonna have a great time. We're getting Anglicans coming from all over the place. We at the event that we're at last night. Michael had a good conversation about some of the work that he's doing now around Henri Nouwen and clericalism, and he's had some work in the Globe and Mail recently. Rob, maybe you've got a question about that.
I wanted to ask you, Michael, in regards to a piece that you wrote for the Globe and Mail, which is entitled "The Radical Change Needed for the Catholic Church to Survive." And I just want to put this quote out for folks to listen to and then get your response to that, if I may. In the article, you write, Pope Francis's lay critics massively underestimate him. There is work still to be done, and he won't be cowed. He has his mission as Pope, and he won't be swayed. That work specifically is tackling the curse of clericalism, the root cause of our institutional pathology. Along with his immediate predecessors, his reactionary detractors, and his supportive Episcopal colleagues, they have all identified clericalism as the culprit. So, Michael, perhaps just a brief explanation of what you mean when you're talking about clericalism, and then maybe elaborate on the curse of clericalism as you see it.
The phrase "curse of clericalism," Robbie, occurred first in the literature, if you like, in a prominent way, at the First Vatican Council, Second Vatican Council's first session in the fall of 1962, when the Bishop of Bruges in Belgium, Bishop de Smet, gave his intervention and spoke about the curse of clericalism. This is the first major instance we have in which it was at least publicly identified as problematic in Roman Catholic history. Now, that's not to suggest clericalism hasn't been a problem from the outset. It clearly has been, and during various centuries it's risen, declined, and in terms of its importance. It is significant now because it's reached pathological dimensions, and it is not insignificant to note that Pope John Paul II, but more particularly Pope Benedict and most especially Pope Francis, have talked about clericalism as the root problem of the current crisis or malaise in the Roman Catholic Communion. But it's frustrating to the degree that everybody says it's clericalism, but nobody especially sets out to address the problem. For Pope Francis, clericalism is basically the placing of the priest on a pedestal, the sense that the priest enjoys a certain immunity in our culture and deference, and uses that position as a position of power rather than sacramental ministry to exert his own claims for entitlement. I think that that's a good definition of clericalism, and I think it's in fact endemic in the system. The problem is, however, it's deeper than that, and it also requires, I think, a more radical surgery. When the bishops with the Pope say that the problem is clericalism, we have to address it, sometimes they simply mean we have to bring more lay people into the conversation. We have to bring more lay people into the diagnosis of the problem, more lay people as part of the solution. The difficulty with that argument is that you're still avoiding the issue of clericalism and how one sets about to eradicate it. And there are certain surgeries that are going to be necessary. And I think the most important, quite frankly, is the elimination of the seminary system. The seminary system that we have in the Roman Catholic Church really came into existence after the Council of Trent in the 16th century. Charles Borromeo, saint, a bishop, a theologian from Milano, was a very important figure as well in the establishment of the seminaries, and they were good things. The seminaries were designed to regulate formation and training, to address the issue of widespread clerical ignorance and illiteracy, to deal with the problem of clerical concubinage, or clerical marriage, which was a big problem in the church, and also to identify the challenges that were coming from the reformers. How can you have priests dealing with these issues if they don't understand the issues, as we would phrase it currently? So the seminaries had an important role to play, and they were an instrument or agency of reform. Now, several centuries later, there's just simply a rarefied, archaic redoubt of intellectual and spiritual resistance to modernity. They don't achieve anything of consequence except really inculcate an attitude of entitlement and special vocation, or some argue, even absurd though it may be, of ontological differentiation from the status of the lay people. This is all muddle. It's a metaphysical muddle, really, and the issue should be around how do we free the presbyterate, the priesthood, from the clutches of clericalism. And I think that's what needs to be addressed. And unless that's addressed, we're not really going to deal with it in its root way, because the seminary is a cocoon. It's a womb. It's protective. Look, I was in the seminary myself way back in the 1960s, and it was a wonderful experience. I mean, the sense of camaraderie was important, the sense of being one with others, developing a sense of who you are yourself. But it was also very clear, and this was immediately after the council, it was also very clear that you saw yourself as part of the elect, that you were entitled to certain things by virtue of your office or by virtue of your ministry. I was a seminarian. I was not ordained when I left. So I was in the early years of my formation, and I kind of liked it. But it was intellectually sterile. You realize afterwards it was a hothouse of immaturity in many ways. And the need to develop psychosexually, the need to develop spiritually, the need to develop prayer life, the need to develop what Nouwen would call appropriate levels of intimacy, these things just simply weren't there as options. I think the seminary structure has changed since then, and I'm not sure for the best. I mean, the seminary immediately after the council had the spirit of renewal and reform to it. Now it's more archaic than it's been in a long time, And I'm convinced, on the basis of both empirical evidence and anecdotal, that it is a major obstacle or hurdle to significant reform and to the hopeful extirpation of the curse of clericalism.
Wow, that's a lot.
That's right.
You
Well,
did
I
good.
wanted to give a soundbite.
No, it's a
Yes,
very good
that's
soundbite.
right. That was a
And
good
we'll
That's
use
my
it-
idea of a
yeah,
soundbite.
Yeah, and you
Yeah.
know, that's very good. Michael, we've had opportunity over the last couple of years as we've gotten to know each other to chat about some of these things. One of the interesting reflections that you've had is about Pope Francis and his current approach to these things, which began really the night of his election as Pope, and when they were preparing him to be presented to the community outside waiting. Perhaps a word about that event and how it really set a statement right from the beginning.
Well, there's some element to it that is perhaps a mite apocryphal.
Yes.
But the story itself is symbolic, I think, of the change that he was
Yes.
going to usher in. Many of you may remember, your audience may remember, that when Francis was elected, he came out onto the loggia, and rather than give his immediate benediction to the world, he asked for their prayers. He had a moment of silence, and very especially, he declined the cope that was being put around his shoulders. And it is alleged that he said to Monsignor Marino, who is the major domo, that the carnival is over.
Yes.
And although
Remember that.
although we're not sure whether that is exactly right,
Right.
or whether it's just an apocryphal
Right. Yeah. Could be legend at this
recollection.
point.
That's
but-
right. That's right. The point is, it illustrates really quite powerfully and encapsulates the special recognition that Francis had that the church that he was now called to lead in a special way was going to move outside the Renaissance court.
Right.
This is an astonishing move for the Roman Catholic Church. We should recognize that his predecessor had a special fondness for 19th century raiment, and even unearthed tiara and cope and chasubles of popes long since deceased. And although this may have some aesthetic appeal for him, and therefore it's a kind of harmless indulgence, it does symbolically suggest that version of church, that particular kind of ecclesiology, reached its apex during the Ratzinger years, and that we're going to see during the Bergoglio years, just as we did during the years of Papa Giovanni, now Pope St. John the 23rd, a undermining or a moving away from what really is the modality, the atmosphere, and the mentality of a Renaissance court. I remember one time being rebuked, and quite rightly, by a distinguished Jesuit historian when I alluded to it as being a medieval court. He said, no, it was not a medieval court. The excesses, the excrescences, the developments that we're facing in contemporary Catholic ecclesiology in relation to the Vatican, in relation to the See of Peter, is not medieval, but Renaissance.
Yes.
And I think, of course, who am I to question an historian? But I think, of course, he's absolutely right.
Yeah. Well.
There's a term that's going through my head as you were speaking just now about the Pope and that day, and also when you were speaking about clericalism, and it's comes from Henri Nouwen, who I know you know well as his biographer. And the phrase is downward mobility. Downward mobility. And we chatted a little bit about it on our first podcast, and it's something that I preached on a little bit a week or two ago using that word, or those two words. But he was, of course, referring to it in his vocation of moving from academia into the large community and such. But I'm hearing you speak, and I'm seeing the broader church needing to grasp that in some ways, understanding ourselves as being
Absolutely, Bobby. The Pope is very clear that the church is to be a church of the poor.
Yeah.
Francis doesn't hedge on this.
Right.
All right. So this is not a church of privilege. It's not a church of entitlement. It's not a church that protects the rights and perks of those in episcopal office, or indeed those lay people who feed on this system. I think we have to be really careful. There are magnificent priests who do the best that they possibly can to work outside the strictures of clericalism, and there are lay people who adore, who parasitic, who find the clerical structure particularly appealing.
Yes.
And so clericalism is not profession or vocation specific to the degree that other people cannot be infected by clericalism. And so when the Pope talks about this, although it is primarily about the presbyterate, it is not exclusively so. And moving away from any sense of entitlement, privilege, superior status, one of the reasons why he's constantly admonishing members of the Curia, bishops and cardinals, and warning priests is the sin of pride, hubris, the easy judgment with which they approach people. Mm-hmm. And this comes from several factors, I think. Number one, his much deeper grasp of the meanings of inherent in the gospel about human freedom and poverty, his training as a Jesuit, mm-hmm. his experience as the Cardinal Archbishop of Buenos Aires, and his identification with the theology of the people, the Teoria de Puebla, in which his version, or it is the Argentinian version of liberation theology, mm-hmm. and it is very clear that he is a person of the people, and that he sees the calling of priesthood as ministry, as service, not as august office or privileged rank or career mobility. For Pope Francis, and you can see it in many of his locutions, many of his addresses, many of his off-the-cuff interviews, talks regularly not just about the curse of clericalism, but of the sin of careerism. He's very specific about that. Yeah. And the priesthood is a calling, it is not a career. Well, tell that to the large number of professional clerics for whom it is indeed their profession, and who have confounded their calling with their profession.
That's right.
And this need for further their ambitious goals and whatnot, for Francis, is the radical contradiction of the nature of their own ministry. Right. So he's pretty firm about this. His task, however, is indomitable.
It's monumental.
It's enormous, right? Yeah. And now, because of the current scandals, the spate of scandals, which are by no means over, you're going to see that this crisis will actually, I think, help rather than hinder Francis, because it brings his enemies out into the open, right, which you are seeing in significant abundance. Also, you have to realize it's very much a minority voice.
Right.
The minority voice even within the hierarchy. Yes. So it's not as if this is one grand swell of resistance or rebellion by all those who are his associates in the episcopate. It is not. Yeah. But it is a vocal, and it is a determined, tenacious group of senior clerics who are convinced that they're saving the church from Francis's recklessness, and who crave the restoration of the Benedictine primacy.
They use words like militant.
Militant, that's right.
So a little bit of pushback.
Oh, you could say that. And I think that beyond just what he said, I think the other thing for me, in terms of, like, that night of the Pope's election was just monumental, in the sense that the actions, to me, were so profound. And I think that so many things that Francis has done since have been profound. I mean,
you were in the piazza waving the Newfoundland provincial.
That was me with the provincial flag. That was probably me. Yeah. But I was moved, for instance, at his first opportunity to do Holy Thursday, which was briefly right after washing the feet of prisoners and women
and Muslims.
Mm-hmm. When a previous
what an image that was.
And in contrast to the year previous, when his predecessor, Benedict, was concerned about priestly obedience, and instead of standing or kneeling, and washing the feet of women, of Muslims, of prisoners, he washed the feet of male celibates only, and he used it as an occasion to sit on a throne and preach about being obedient to the papal see. And I thought, well, that's really, this Pope is really, by action, showing a vast difference from there. That was a big shift for me.
Yes, and Benedict's theological vision is a very different one from Francis. This is more academic, of course. It's more organic. It's really 19th century German to some degree. But it's also very erudite and very learned.
cerebral.
So it's cerebral, and although there were some pastoral implications to it, it's a fixed system. I mean, I've taught in graduate school. I've taught Ratzinger's thought, and it is attractive in many ways. It's a carefully, skillfully structured theological architecture.
Yeah.
But in many ways, it's not persuasive,
Right.
and in many other ways, it's not even credible.
Right.
But he is, I think he's a more serious theologian than John Paul II. But I think that with Francis, you don't quite have the same level of theological sophistication, though it would be very unwise to assume that he is a theological novice.
Right.
He knows exactly what he's doing. He's well trained. He's reflective. He's just chosen a different kind of strategy at a very difficult time in the history of the church.
Yeah.
And he's
Now-
dealing with the issues that should have been dealt by his predecessors. right?
Absolutely.
He's inherited quite a fair bit of baggage.
Just to shift gears a little bit, I know you have many roles. Michael happens to be, besides all this writing that he does, he spends his time in 3 countries all the time because he's between Ireland and the United States and here. In Ireland, he is working as the head of John Moriarty's ecological.
The John Moriarty Institute for
There
Ecology
you go.
and Spirituality.
Yeah. And part of the work that you're doing this weekend is running this pilgrimage for us at St. Aidan's, where folks are going to learn about John Moriarty and John O'Donahue. The name O'Donahue is not unfamiliar to a number of people in this part of the world, but the name Moriarty, at least John Moriarty, is a little less familiar in terms of his work and his writing. And I wonder if you could help us elaborate. One of the things that I heard just the other day as I was preparing for this were these words of him speaking them, which was really quite
Moriarty.
profound. Yeah, where Moriarty says, "When people ask me, 'Are you happy?' I'd say that isn't quite the question. The real question is, am I still growing? Have I become a finished creation? Am I dead or am I still growing? Is my life still an adventure full of trouble, full of joy, full of pain, full of cataclysm? Am I still living dangerously? So am I still growing is the real question." This man is fascinating. The reading that you've put me onto, I only heard of John Moriarty when I ran into Michael back in June at a institute at the Oblate School of Theology in Texas, San Antonio, and he began to tell me about Moriarty and what he was doing there, and I got into reading it, and it's spellbinding stuff. So I wonder if you can share with our listeners a bit about Moriarty and about the institute, and why you feel that work is important. I know you're doing a book right now too. So
Yes, the Moriarty was a remarkable figure who died in 2017, so it's not been that long. And although he is very well known in Ireland through his work on RTE, the National Public Broadcaster, but some of his teaching at the University of Galway, he's unknown outside the country.
Right.
And
Mm-hmm.
even though he spent 6 years in Canada at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg teaching English, he's an extraordinary figure because he's a multi-dimensional chap. I mean, he's part mystic, part poet, part ecologist, part environmentalist, a great part storyteller, part historian, part mythographer. His works are basically laced with his autobiography. He's a modern St. Patrick because he takes on the bardic and oral role of Patrick as originally conceived, not the sanitized, sentimental Patrick of the St. Patrick's Day parades.
The one that they green up the river for.
Yeah, exactly. And nothing to do with that Patrick. But he is a man who had a profound personal sense of the innate numinosity or beauty of our spiritual calling, which was a recognition of the fact that we are an integral part of nature, tooth and claw. He was not a naive romantic. He lived in Connemara, he lived on the Burren, he lived latterly in the foot of Mount Mangerton in County Kerry, and he struggled to recover what he calls his bush soul. How do I find my way back into nature? He had experienced as a teenager, I hope you're listening to this, Ian, he had experienced as a teenager a profound crisis in his life because I guess about around grade 11, he read the entire Charles Darwin Origin of Species, all right? And it precipitated a crisis. How could one reconcile evolution with his understanding of Christianity? And so, as he says, he fell out of his story. That's his phrase. The calamity of my life was I fell out of my story. The rest of his life is spent trying to work his way back into that story. How is it possible to make evolution meaningful within the context of Christian revelation, but also in the light of other great religious traditions and mythologies and stories told by native and sometimes now archaic cultures or disappeared cultures? And so that became the passion of his life. A passion that was greatly driven by his new understanding of evolution, which I'll talk about in the weekend, his growing sense of the mystical, his profound ability, comprehensive ability, to bring all these different mythologies, and they could be Tibetan, they could be Norse, they could be from the Blackfoot people. It didn't matter. He was very well read. He had a photographic memory. He was a genius in so many fundamental ways. And he most of his life he spent as a gardener, as a landscape guy, working these grand estates on the southwest coast of Ireland. And then he was write his works. And his works are really largely unedited. And I think, that Kevin is absolutely right. There's something that is rapturous and beautiful about these wonderful stories, this very rich language that brings you into a different orbit of understanding, a different spiritual imagination, if you like. So I think Moriarty is, to some degree, a contributing figure to the antidote of our Christian malaise, because he offers new hope. Karl Rahner once said that the Christian of the next century must be a mystic. To be a Christian, you need to be a mystic. Well, if that is in fact true, if Rahner is correct, then this Moriarty will provide us with a blueprint of how we can achieve that in our ordinary lives. He, as I said, he died in the year 2017. He was about 69 at the time of his death. 2007, I'm sorry, he was 69 at the time of his death. So it's only been about 11 years since Moriarty's been with us. And the Sacred Heart University's John Moriarty Institute for Ecology and Spirituality in County Kerry, Dingle, is designed to provide a space, a learning space, where people can come and appreciate something about his own journey and its particular relevance for their own. And this year, we're doing our first pilgrimage, what we call an edu tour, in which we will be taking people to various highlights of Moriarty's life on the island of Inishfallen, in Loch Lina, to Loch Ina, a different one, where he had a kind of transformation experience, which we now recognize very deeply as the dark night of the soul, and talks about that in Carmelite mystical language as well, and other places where he lived and where he worked. And it is to bring people, the tour is called Walking Beautifully Upon the Earth, which is his phrase, in the footsteps of John Moriarty. And it'll be parts of Ireland they've never seen before. And it'll be, we hope, a genuine spiritual experience for them. So the university is so serious about this and about the importance of offering a voice of hope in a darkening time. Right. And as we all know, the situation is really quite bleak in the United States these days, and people are looking for some kind of direction. They're looking for some kind of luminary, right? Similarly, in Ireland, the Roman Catholic Church in Ireland is in massive meltdown. But there are spiritual figures who exist in the Irish landscape who have offered ways of recovering a kind of primitive Christianity. I don't mean primitive in the sense of unsophisticated, I mean primitive in the sense of, being of the roots, the origin. Right. And I think that Moriarty is one of these people. Right. And the more people who become acquainted with his work, I think the more we will generate interest in his kind of Christian vision, which is very much in keeping with Teilhard de Chardin and other Christian mystics, and offers a credible voice in a turbulent time.
Right. I love that you use the word recover.
Yes, recovering.
Recovering, bringing us back to the roots of what is often watered down and misunderstood in our Christianity today. And I come from that place. And one of my great joys in my learning that I've been doing over the last 20 years is to rediscover and learn what I didn't know about Christianity, the roots of it. I come from a place that you know, I was, like many people, told that this is what it was.
Yeah.
And this is what you're to understand, and just leave it at that. But to get into this in a more mystical sense and to understand it more and recover some of the tenets of the faith and some of that has been a wonderful experience. And I think people are longing for that because they know there's got to be more than perhaps maybe what they've been hearing in the pulpit or being told. Yeah, there's something deeper to get to here, and what a wonderful way to bring that out for them.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Robbie, because, you know, the two great pillars of understanding, the principles of understanding with regard to what the Second Vatican Council was doing for the Roman Catholic Church, and I think to a great degree to the Christian world, were using the storied Jesuit historian John O'Malley's phrases, were two particular points of entry. One was aggiornamento, which is a very glib, translation into English of this Italian phrase would be updating, upgrading, and modernizing. And the other is the French word ressuscimo, going back to the original sources, going back to the primary sources. And so how do you do both? How do you maintain the tension, right? How do you adapt, as you're trying to do with crossings, by coming into conversation with culture, at the same time going deeper into the sources, the veins of meaning and richness that are part of the subterranean reality of the Church's life, going deeper into it. And it is very interesting that one of the outstanding images that you find in his writing, Moriarty's writing, is his experience in the Grand Canyon. His going down into the Grand Canyon, and he has experience of Christ at the foot of the canyon, at the end of Bright Angel Trail. And I think that is not insignificant, because for Moriarty, the great, and it was a recovery, so it's going back again, the great recovery ritualistically, psychologically, and theologically for him was the descent into hell. You know, in the Creed, the Apostles' Creed, we talk about Jesus descending to the dead, going to Hades and whatnot, and this is usually Holy Saturday as we wait for the risen Christ. And this moment, Moriarty conceives at the moment of the redemption of all evidence.
It's the harrowing of hell.
It's the harrowing of hell. A great symbol, a great icon that is maintained in Eastern Christianity, and that was very important in the Western Church up until the Middle Ages. But after the Reformation, we've lost it. There's only one chapel that I know that deals with a powerful icon of the harrowing of hell, and that's our chapel at Sacred Heart. And they didn't even know it was the harrowing of hell. They talked about it as a post-resurrection image. And I went in and I said, well, this is the harrowing of hell. And they said, well, we call it we call it the chapel of the Holy Spirit. And I said, well, it is, of course, but it's the chapel of the harrowing of hell. And they said, that'd be tough to brand that. Parents coming to the campus saying, well, come to our harrowing of hell chapel, right? So I said, it needs a little explanation, a little background here, right? But it is a central Christian doctrine that needed to be recovered. Moriarty recovers it for us.
Very good.
Now tell me just a word more about that, I guess, in that Rob mentioned earlier about Nouwen's theology of downwardly mobile.
Downward mobility.
Yeah, downward mobility. And just as it relates to Moriarty and his experience of deciding to go back, of being in Winnipeg. I wonder if you could say a word about that story. You write about it in a recent article in the Tablet, which is just, you read the opening paragraph of that article of yours, and it just it's mind-blowing because you have this image which you paint. I wonder if you could share that with our listeners.
Well, he does. He says also at one point when he's going back, he leaves with the University of Winnipeg and University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, and this is a great job for him, right? He's well paid. He's enjoying it, but he has to go back to Ireland, and he goes back. And he says, you know what the New World taught him? He loved the New World. But the New World taught him to see the Old World in a new way. So he goes back and he begins his descent into the sacred caverns, right? Digging deeper and deeper. And part of that was his experience in Canada, his experience with a whiteout. And he talks about that. He said, you want to know, he comments on this in one of his RTE conversations. He said, everybody here's had a blackout, and we all think, oh, God, a blackout is really dangerous. Try a whiteout. try being in a blizzard
Come to
in
Winnipeg.
Manitoba.
Come to Winnipeg.
In the winter. And he said, that whole experience and his surviving that experience, because he was the only one on the campus out in the whiteout because he didn't realize the campus had closed down for the day. He was kind of a clueless chap. And he's out there and he realizes the only way he's going to survive is to do what the buffalo does, which is to head into it.
Right.
So he
Walk
does what
into
the
it,
buffalo
yeah.
does. And it was the realization that, a connection with his natural soul and creation at large was going to be essential not only for him, but indeed for our civilization. Mm-hmm. So what he learns in Canada and in the United States, but principally Canada, he brings back to Ireland and then elaborates a quite marvelous theory, theological and anthropological theory, that I think goes some way as an antidote to our collective despair.
Very good.
Fantastic stuff.
Well, we're getting a good tee up for the weekend.
Yeah.
then.
Oh, yeah.
That's good.
Hope you
That's
show
good.
up now.
Yeah, well, I'll be there. No,
I've seen this before.
I gotta buy this book now.
Yeah.
I gotta get home and order some books. Well, that's great. So
I just wonder too if I should probably say that Michael, if you're not familiar with Michael's writing, I'd suggest you get on Amazon and just type Michael W Higgins.
Don't forget the W.
Don't forget the W, because there are all kinds of Michael Higgins out there. But you'll his work about Henri Nouwen, Genius Born of Anguish, Jean Vanier, Logician of the Heart, Thomas Merton, A Faithful Visionary, The Unquiet Monk on Thomas Merton as well, Suffer the Children Unto Me, which is an open inquiry into clerical sex abuse in the church, as well as many, many other works which you might find very interesting. I've been reading many of them, and Michael, I've been fortunate to come to know you as a friend, besides just somebody I've been reading for years. So what a great thrill we have to have him with us today.
Yeah, we're thrilled you're here, and thank you for taking the time to jump into our little podcast here and share with us. And I know the people at St. Aidan's this weekend will be talking about this weekend for a long time to come. I'm looking forward to hearing more of what you have to say. So.
Well, I came for the fish and chips.
That's right, and we took
Yeah.
care of that at Crossings.
I stayed for the conversation.
Very
well, we
good.
must say
Very
that the
good.
fish and chips at Crossings here today was excellent.
That's
Fantastic.
As
Yeah.
I-
Commercial branding.
Yeah,
That's
commercial
right.
branding is
That's
right. Now,
right.
I must say, as a fellow who comes from Newfoundland, I'm a little leery of being this far away from the Atlantic and ordering fish and chips.
I could understand that.
But
a chip is a chip.
a chip is a chip,
Yeah,
but a
the
fish is not a
fish is
fish is not a
different. Yeah,
fish.
that's
You
right.
must understand. In cod we trust, Michael.
That's right.
And with that corn,
Well, thank you to Michael. Thank you to producer Ian for taking care of all our technical work as always today, and for writing, by the way, which was a fantastic opening and closing musical segment
Yeah.
for our podcast, Ian.
I know
Yeah,
you're
that's
all
right.
rocking
Those-
when this thing
those-
started
yeah.
earlier. You're rocking to it
Those
coming in.
residual checks will be flying in any day now. believe
right,
me.
yeah.
And thank you for tuning in and being part of this. We'll look forward to get together with you again in the future.
Well, you know where you can find us is on YouTube, SoundCloud, and also on iTunes by just typing in the Vicars Crossing. You can email us if you have comments on today's podcast at vicarscrossing@gmail.com. And we look forward to you hearing our stuff and sending along your comments and your ideas, what we may be able to do on our future podcasts. We hope that our next podcast, we haven't firmed up the date and time yet, but we're hoping to have Mayor Matt Brown on, who's on his way out of office. We've just had an election. We've elected a new mayor here in town, Ed Holder, and perhaps he'll be a future guest for us as well. But these are interesting and exciting times. So we're glad to have you all along with us on the ride.
Very good. So on behalf of Kevin and myself, Rob, and Michael, and producer Ian, take care until we get back together again, and remember to look both ways
Before you cross the street.
Thank you for listening. Our hosts are Kevin George and Rob Henderson. Our producer and composer is myself, Ian, with original artwork done by Catherine Olenek. If you have any questions or want to know how to find us, tweet us at Vicars Crossing or find us on Facebook at The Vicars Crossing. If you have any other questions about anything heard on this podcast, please look in the description to find out more. Thank you.